Hello my lovely fellow pagans and pantheists. So I am actually sitting in front of the camera this time, as I promised in the last video. It's just been kind of hard to get back into the swing of sitting down and being ready to make a video and kind of feeling prepared for it, because I've been getting used to this new space. I'm sitting currently in my sacred space outside in the shed in the garden, and this is the first video that I'm making in here in front of the camera, so that's interesting. It's quite a change. It's funny how you get so used to sitting down in the same place every time and with the same environment and the same kind of camera setup, and you really get used to doing things a certain way. So this is interesting. So what I want to talk to you about today is something that I haven't really spoken about in any great detail on the YouTube channel. I have blogged about it a little bit, and that is environmentalism and paganism, and also just environmentalism and spirituality or religion as a whole as well. And I haven't really thought this through. I haven't made any notes, and I'm really just going to be riffing on this and just seeing what kind of comes to mind, because it is, for me anyway, a really complicated issue. And I know for a lot of pagans and a lot of people in general, it's actually quite a simple issue, and their religiosity or their spirituality is very innately tied to their environmentalism, and for them there is no issue there. There's no tension there between their different kind of sets of beliefs. They kind of flow naturally from one to the other. And whereas I've always found that connection for me to be slightly complicated and slightly convoluted. So what I actually talked about before on the blog was that for me, my environmentalism has actually nothing to do with my paganism or my pantheism. And since then, I think I've started to realise that that's actually not the case. And the reason that I said that, the reason I came to that conclusion, was that as a pantheist, everything is sacred, and therefore even the processes that are destroying the ecosystem, that are making vast and really destructive changes to the planet, even those tendencies, even those patterns that we've kind of set up, that we've put into motion, even those are sacred, because as a pantheist I very much believe that humans are just as sacred as anything else, and that even the destructive forces that humans have set in motion, even the selfishness that we have kind of displayed as we have progressed as a species, all of that is sacred, because everything is sacred. And even those things that we see as being negative or destructive are in some way sacred, because pantheism is the belief that everything is sacred and nothing is outside of that. And I think some pantheists do kind of see the human society in particular, and kind of the human impact and effect on the world, as being kind of outside of that sacredness. And that, you know, the sacredness of cosmos is something natural, something that happens without our input, and then any input we have, any effect we have on the world is in some way impeding that sacred natural flow. And that's just not the way I see it. That to me is upholding the same dualistic thinking that a lot of monotheistic, Abrahamic kind of religions have, where it's sort of in some way man against the world. And that to me has never ever made sense. To me, if the natural world is sacred, then humans are sacred, and everything we do is therefore sacred. That's not to say that I think that a lot of what we do is good, or is positive, or even moral, or anything like that. I definitely think that the way that we are going about things is hugely immoral. But that to me is very different to being... The question of morality for me is quite separated from the question of how sacred something is, or whether it's worthy of reverence. Now, that all being said, and this was kind of the big problem that I kept coming up against when I was writing about this before, is that, okay, so logically I believe that a landfill site or a concrete building is just as sacred as a tree or a waterfall. And while logically I kind of felt like, well, that must be the case if everything is sacred, it doesn't sit right. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who will actually look at or think about a landfill and think, oh yes, that is so sacred. No, it doesn't really work. There is this innate feeling within us anytime that we have created something that is destructive or in some way like not aesthetically pleasing, that is damaging other animals or plants or parts of the ecosystem. There is something within us that sort of innately kind of rebels against that and just doesn't find that worthy of reverence, and that kind of finds it jarring, and that automatically starts to see that as being something outside of nature. The way I reconciled this before was that, because I will just say that while I find, say for example, if an animal is in pain or has some sort of disease, I find that very, very upsetting, and it definitely moves me a lot. Anything like that, anything about kind of death or say animals hunting and killing other animals and things like that. Sometimes that is very moving and it doesn't feel positive, but I can still find God or goddess in that. I can still find the sacred seed within that, because it taps me back into that natural cycle of death and rebirth, life, death, life again. So even in situations where there is something that kind of jars or something that is upsetting for us or anything like that, even in a lot of situations like that, within what seems like a natural context, it can seem kind of part of, I see that as being sort of the dark mother, the devouring mother, the dark aspect, the destructive side of the creative cycle of cosmos. So while it might be hard to see it as a wholly positive thing, and I don't think we need to see things like that as a positive thing. I don't think, I don't think like plague and infection and all these terrible things needs to be seen as a positive thing. But like I say, as long as it's seen as something being within that natural cycle, it is much easier for me to get in touch with that feeling of reverence and awe. Whereas something that is very clearly the result of humans, it's much harder, or it's impossible, in fact, to get in touch with that feeling of awe and reverence. And the reason that I came up with for this before was that a large part of the feeling of awe that we have and reverence that we have for nature is that it is outside of our control. That the feeling of awe itself is actually just this sense of amazement that all of this is unraveling before our eyes. All of this creativity is happening before us without our input, without us having any say in the matter, and completely outside of our control. And for some reason that seems to be innately amazing for humans. Perhaps particularly because we are so used to trying to control everything. We're so used to being able to change things and move things around and shape things into what we need them to be. We're so used to having to work to create things in our lives, to make things into what we want them to be. And so when we actually observe things that are happening completely outside of our control, it kind of taps us back into that, remembering how small and insignificant we are. And at the end of the day, cosmos and life is much, much bigger than anything that we can ever do, and even any damage that we can ever do to this planet. And that was kind of my understanding of why we feel awe about those things and absolutely not about things that are simply human controlled. Most of the time. There is the question of art, but that's such a complicated subject that I'm not even going to go near it in this video. And if I start talking about art, it's going to get very complicated, and I won't stop for about half an hour. So we'll leave that out of the question for the moment. But basically, in recent times, that has just not been, or even when I wrote that original blog post, it never really sat right with me, that this idea that my feelings of reverence and awe were, that they're being connected to the natural world outside of human control, was only because of this sort of psychological trick. That never really quite sat right with me. But for a long time, like I say, I was kind of thinking of my environmentalism and my feelings that what we are doing as humans to the planet is in some way immoral. I was seeing that as something different. Because, like I say, I don't see morality as actually being innately tied to spirituality or religion. And this probably comes from my spiritual practice being very individual and being very personal. That I don't do spiritual practice in a group. It's not a communal thing for me. It's a very personal, individual thing for me. And morality at the end of the day is all about our conduct in the world towards other people and towards other beings and the planet as a whole. And that, because that's a societal kind of communal thing, that is kind of outside the remit of my spirituality for me. It is very important to me. But it is outside of it. I also don't see good and evil, as so many pagans do say. I don't see good and evil as being innate in cosmos. I see them as being a product of society, and I think probably humanity. For me, an act or something, a thing, an event, something that comes about, it only becomes evil because there is evil intent, because there is negative intent. So I think, as far as we can tell about animal consciousness, there does seem to be a limit to their level of self-awareness, and I think it is that self-awareness that allows us to be evil. And essentially the evil arises because we do something with full knowledge that it is having a negative impact on somebody else and that we are doing it for selfish reasons. And obviously morality is very, very complicated. Again, morality and ethics, it's not something that I'm going to get into hugely in this video. But for me it was always kind of boxed to one side. Morality is over here and my spiritual practice is over there. And while I think that there is a lot of space, and actually that's very important to have a communal religion, it's kind of something out of my control, that I don't really have the control in my life right now to try to be setting that up or to be celebrating in a communal way, and therefore my morality for me was a kind of quite a different philosophical thing, more associated with my political views and that kind of thing than with my spiritualities. I was seeing quite a big divide there, and I would definitely say that that is still the case for me. So for me, my environmentalism, as has probably come across from what I've said there, it comes from that sense of morality which is tied to society and humanity, and this idea that because we are aware that we are damaging the earth, because we are aware of the destructive nature of society, of the way that we have developed, that is what puts lays the moral judgment on us, and that makes it imperative for us to actually try to reverse the damage that we've done, and in some way try to contain the effect that we're having on the ecosystem, on the world. But the reasons why this is a moral imperative is they're quite complicated, and there are a lot of different reasons, there are a lot of different ways that you can look at it, and when you really start to philosophically untangle those reasons, it does start to get quite circular, and you will find sometimes that your reasoning starts to come back to quite a dualistic, almost Abrahamic kind of way of thinking, rather than a more pagan one, which is kind of strange. Even though paganism in general is much more associated with environmentalism than the Abrahamic religions. And the reason for this primarily, as the way I see it, is the lack of the kinds of dualities that we see in the Abrahamic religions. I'm speaking mostly about Christianity because that's what I'm familiar with. The idea of the split between nature and man, man and God, God and nature. There is this kind of history and tradition of separating humanity from the rest of nature, because humanity are seen, particularly men, are seen as being closer to God. That we're sort of this kind of halfway house between the material, which is seen as being sort of vulgar almost, and the kind of high holiness of God. And the understanding is that humans have to sort of overcome our humanity and our physical nature, our base physical nature, and rise to the holiness of God. And this is kind of, as many people have noted, this is kind of given humans permission to have control, to exert their control over the rest of the planet, over animals, over it's explicitly stated in the Bible that humans are allowed to have control over other animals, other plants, that they are just there for our consumption. And obviously, I think pretty much all pagans are completely opposed to this. We see nature as being sacred, rather than there being this big divide between God and nature, that nature is not sacred and God is here. There is this feeling that nature either is God or is at least as sacred as God, and therefore there isn't this sort of feeling that we are allowed to just control and use nature, and that we're trying to rise above it, because that is God, and actually submersing ourselves in it and getting attuned to its sacred cycles is in fact the best way, as many pagans feel, to connect to God or goddess, or whatever way whatever word you're using to describe divinity. The problem is that when we start to really unpack the kind of spiritual, moral implications of environmentalism, it almost starts to lead us back to that idea of humans being more important than other species on the planet, or than other things going on in cosmos. I know a lot of people do kind of say that it's for the sake of the other species on the planet, and that we shouldn't be damaging them. But I think really at the end of the day, when we look at the way that we are automatically trying to maintain the Earth's ecosystem in a certain way, maintain nature in a certain way, it is for our own survival. Because while a lot of people talk about like we're destroying the Earth, we're destroying nature, to some degree that is true, but we're not actually destroying the actual planet, and very likely we're not even destroying life. I mean, life is incredibly hardy. It will survive through almost anything. There will be forms of life on this planet, probably for as long as the planet exists, or as long as the sun maintains its actually no, just probably as long as the sun is still burning. And what we're actually striving to do when we talk about trying to control the levels of destructiveness that we're imposing on the planet is actually that we're trying to maintain that sort of sweet spot of the ecosystem in order to best maintain us, sustain us. And sure, yes, the other species that exist around us too. But when we look at the history of the planet, species come and go. It's just part of the natural cycles, that there are always new species coming into being, and then there are always kind of big times of great destruction when huge amounts of the life on the planet will just get completely obliterated, and life just has to kind of start anew. This has happened over and over, and it is just something that happens, and that will happen again. So to some degree, if we talk about maintaining natural cycles, you could just see what we're doing to the planet as being just the next it's just the next disaster. It's the next major disaster, and it does kind of strike you to the core to think of us taking everyone else down with us. But at the same time, like I say, in the grand scheme of things, the planet will still be here, and so will life. And you could say that it's just an inevitable part of the process. Of course, that's not how I feel and how a lot of people feel. It still feels, you feel very strongly as though, no, that's not right. If we kind of know what we're doing, if we can see what we're doing, surely we should be trying to stop it. But that's where the kind of complex philosophical issue comes in, where I anyway start to ask myself, but why? Like, why is it so important for us to maintain, let's say that we are pretty much just doing it to maintain ourselves, to maintain humans on the planet. Why is that so important? Why is it so important to maintain the status quo, and why is it important that humans continue to thrive? And then you kind of start, it does kind of start coming back to that feeling of great privilege, that there is something special about humans because we are conscious, and because we have built up this wealth of knowledge and understanding about cosmos. I think there is, underlying all of this, a sense that there is something special going on here, and it would be an awful shame to not see it through to the end. And of course it's just a natural impulse as well to want to maintain the status quo, to want to allow the species that are on the planet currently to thrive, and also just to keep things the same. You know, we're all a little bit afraid of death, and I think the impulse to want to contain the damage that we're doing is part of that fear. Not only the death of the self, but the death of the species. So it's almost kind of like a wider version of that. And then of course, the further out you go, the more you think about the wider cosmos, the more tiny and insignificant the whole thing really does seem. And again, this varies hugely depending on how you see cosmos, how you understand life, to what you think it's all kind of about, and whether you believe that we are unique, that we are a fluke, and that we are potentially the only conscious beings in the universe, or whether you think that no, that there probably are a lot more, that this is probably just a process that comes about, that it is a tendency, and that there are other conscious beings out there, that there is a tendency towards consciousness. And this, I tend towards the belief that there are other forms of consciousness, that the universe, or cosmos, tends towards consciousness. So my belief is that, I mean, you know, let's face it, we're not going to last forever anyway. The planet is not going to last forever anyway. You know, it's, in the grand scheme of things, it will just be really just a blip. And there is probably only so far we can go with our species in terms of understanding, and in terms of really affecting any change, because we're so tiny. To me, we are really just part of some much greater cycle, and that we will just fall out of being again, but that more forms of consciousness will continue to evolve. And then, as I've talked about before, I do have this kind of very vague idea that on some kind of higher level, that there are other forms of consciousness, that it kind of goes on, possibly infinitely, and that there are infinitely greater forms of consciousness, kind of on higher levels up. And from that perspective, kind of one species, one conscious species, or one, I say consciousness, oh, let's not get into definitions of consciousness. I'm saying consciousness, and I mean kind of human-like consciousness, but it's a, you know, it's a kind of a sliding scale. Yeah, the demise of one conscious species at the end of the day is not really all that significant. And I think this is why it has always seemed to me to be a moral issue and a societal issue, rather than something greater and something connected to my spirituality and my beliefs about divinity. Because I don't necessarily feel that we are hugely special. I mean, everything seems special to me. Everything, it's all a miracle that it exists at all. But I wouldn't privilege us within that. Having said all that, I do just want to come back to a statement I made kind of earlier on, and just reinforce the fact that despite all of that, there is this kind of, from the side of morality and just trying to create as little negativity and destruction on the planet as possible. And there's a very, very basic part of me that just kind of says, no, you know, I don't want to be a part of creating any more pain and negativity in the world than I have to. And I would like if our species would do the same. But I do just like to kind of get real about that every now and then, and think, and remember that my strongest reasons for being an environmentalist and making some attempt to make changes, it is coming from a kind of a small reason, like an unwillingness to cause pain and discomfort to other beings on this planet. Which in the grand scheme of things it's not cosmic level, you know. But it's still important. It's important to me, and I feel like it should be important to our species. So that all being said, up until fairly recently, I've been seeing those two sides of things as being quite separate. Like I say, I've been seeing that kind of morality issue as being separate to my spirituality. But it's just kind of been dawning on me recently that if I wasn't spiritual, if I had no kind of belief in any form of divinity, or just that any feeling that the universe or the cosmos is sacred, that there's something miraculous or wondrous about it, if I wasn't in the habit of expressing reverence, would I be so concerned about those things? Will I be so concerned about trying to maintain a better relation with other parts of cosmos, with, you know, the rest of the world? Will I be so concerned about my own effect on the world and our species' effect on the world? And I realised that I really wouldn't, and that I used to be quite so concerned. I don't think. I definitely wasn't. I used to be more concerned about kind of humans, I suppose. I was always kind of, you know, very liberal and fairly politically kind of aware as a teenager and growing up and everything. And I became quite disillusioned for a while, but just with feeling that nothing I could do was going to make any change. But it used to be all a lot more focused on kind of society and other humans and other human beings suffering, as opposed to worrying about the environment and things like that. And I think I justified that by all the things that I've said before, that we are so tiny and insignificant. And it always seemed to me that the most important thing is just sort of a more immediate kind of reducing the suffering of other human beings right now. But of course, what about the suffering of other beings on the planet? You know, there's a lot more here than just humans. But I think what I'm trying to say is that the more that you do tap into a sense of connection and reverence and awe, the more important it does become to just be respectful, I suppose. To just, you start to have this great kind of amazement and gratitude towards the earth, because its process has led us here, because its process has allowed us to be conscious beings who are able to feel awe and love and reverence and amazement, and to think about cosmos and kind of revel in it, in all its glory. And even just that gratitude, that sense of connection, that sense of I am not just this separate being, that sense that humans are not just these separate little capsules walking around this sort of barren earth, and that we're the only things that matter in it. You know, it's only important that we reduce our suffering because we're the only things that can feel anything. Like, no, the more spiritually centered I become, the more important it becomes to me to reduce the harm in general. And sure, I believe that there are other conscious beings. I mean, maybe there aren't conscious beings like us, conscious in a similar way to us, in the universe, and maybe there aren't, but I believe that there are. But even then, it seems to me that, okay, perhaps the damage that we are doing to the ecosystem is just part of the next destructive cycle on the earth. Maybe it's just part of a natural cycle, but at the same time, okay, that is where our humanity has brought us so far, but it has also given us awareness of that. Our humanity has meant that we are innately aware of what we're doing, that we have kind of finally opened our eyes and realised that we're doing all this damage. And that to me just, it gives us this duty to actually do something about it and not to just turn a blind eye, because that awareness and that feeling of guilt, it is also part of the natural cycle. And who are we to argue with that? Who are we to question that? And I think that's where it starts to come back into spirituality for me again. That's where I start to feel like, okay, no, maybe this is all one thing. That the reverence I feel for everything natural means that I want that natural cycle to play out and to be allowed to play out in the right way, in the natural way, in the best way, if there is any such thing as the best way. And yeah, if we are actually acting from a place of our natural instinct as human beings, then the natural instinct is to say this isn't right. There's something wrong here. We have to stop poisoning this planet and stop poisoning ourselves and all the other species and plants and everything on it. Because cosmos is sacred, because this isn't just some random happenstance, because it's not just some mechanistic, who cares, we're all just going to die and whatever. You don't have to see it that way. Because it's worthy of reverence, and so therefore we should act with reverence towards it. So I hope that I've managed to put across my thoughts in some sort of coherent way there. I will just mention now at the end of the video, which is another reason that I wanted to talk about this now, is that John Halstead of The Allergic Pagan, his blog, The Allergic Pagan, he's also currently the editor of humanisticpaganism.com. He, for quite a few months now, or it's been a long time actually that he's been working on it, but he has drawn together a lot of pagans to write a statement on environmentalism for pagans to sign. And this kind of process went on for quite a while because he wanted to get a lot of different pagans with different viewpoints together to write the statement so that it was something that people would resonate with, that would be kind of the least, cause the least kind of dissent amongst different types of pagans and people with different types of belief. So this is now, it's live, it's online, you can go and you can sign it. The Pope apparently is going to be making a statement on the environment in June. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but I think it's like late June. And John is hoping that by then that the petition, the statement on environmentalism, the kind of pagan statement on environmentalism, will have 10,000 signatures, and currently it was at 5,000 recently. It's probably gone up again, but if you are interested in this, if this is something that is important to you and you haven't heard about this this statement, then do go and check it out. I'm going to link it below. Do go and check it out, have a read, and if it's something that you feel that you can sign, that you can get on board with, then do sign it and spread the word. Because as much as I admire people who try to limit their impact as much as they possibly can on the earth and on the environment, the big changes are really only going to come from the top down, I think. There need to be political changes, there need to be big movements. And as a group of people who revere the earth, who see the earth as being sacred, who don't see the earth as just being this empty tool that we can use to sustain ourselves before we go up to heaven, I think it's hugely important for pagans to come together as much as possible and to make our voices heard, because some people argue that, you know, putting the environmentalist argument across alongside paganism kind of weakens it and makes people kind of go, oh, it's just pagans being silly or whatever. I don't agree. I think the environmentalist movement, it really needs powerful voices who really care. And, you know, what better way to fuel that argument than to put pagan voices behind it, because, you know, the earth is divine for us, for most of us anyway, and that's hugely powerful. And even if we can kind of put a little bit of that thought, a little bit of that feeling across to other people and start to get people to kind of tap into what's going on and to not just check out and not just be blind about it, and not just make it someone else's problem, then, you know, we will have made some sort of difference. So do go and check that out and do sign if you feel like you can get on board with it. If you feel like it's not something that you're completely opposed to, then please do sign. And thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you again soon.